Okay, so good morning, everyone. Welcome to Sunday Forum. This is an event of Plymouth Congregational Church in Minneapolis. For those of you who are joining us online, who are not here live and in person and already know that. So restrooms, I think everybody here knows where they are. Maybe not everybody knows, just down the hall a little bit on your right. And there are hearing aid devices out there in the hall if you happen to need those. So be aware that that's there. It's my pleasure to introduce Amanda Harrington, our presenter this morning. She is a social worker and attorney in Minneapolis, joined the City of Minneapolis as Director of Community Safety Design and Implementation in December of 2023, transitioned to Director of Neighborhood Safety in May of 2025. Much of her prior career focused on youth and families, including her work as a therapist, school social worker, prosecutor, and manager of the county truancy department. So a wide variety of interesting background stuff. Amanda has a Bachelor's of Science from the College of St. Kate's, a Master's in Social Work from the University of Minnesota, and a JD from the University of St. Thomas School of Law. So wonderful background, and welcome, Amanda.
Well, that's a great introduction. Now I don't have to kind of go through the background pieces. Thank you for joining me this morning, Amanda Harrington. I, as John said, am the director of the Neighborhood Safety Department in the City of Minneapolis. We are one of the newer departments in the city, and so folks don't necessarily know what we do. What I'm going to do today is kind of what I've been asked to do is a wide and deep view of the department. So we'll see how I manage both of those things. The last time I did this presentation, it took an hour. I know I don't have a full hour, but I think what will help is if you hold questions until the end. That'll help me get through. And my timekeeper in the back will kind of forewarn me when we're running out of time. So first, just to situate us in the city, neighborhood safety is one of the 5 departments that reports to Commissioner Barnett. We're part of the Office of Community Safety, and so the group of departments that are considered the safety departments are 911, emergency management, fire, police, and neighborhood safety. This was all done when the city was restructured after 2022. We moved to a strong mayor system, and the Office of Community Safety was created so that we could increase collaboration and coordination between those safety departments. Now, I always feel like I have to say safety doesn't just live in those 5 departments. Safety is also part of public works, it's part of our health department, but this is what they gave us, and we're starting with that coordination, and then we're going to expand. Commissioner Barnett reports up to the mayor, and so kind of now you know where we are within the city. What we do is actually follow public health principles to reduce violence. And so you can see on the screen, the public health principles really talk about primary, secondary, tertiary. If anybody's read the Safe and Thriving Communities report, you could think about that as being prevention, response, and restoration, or sometimes people talk about prevention, intervention, and restoration. So we really want to spend most of our time preventing violence before it happens, sometime intervening once violence has occurred, and then the smallest amount of time doing restoration. Trauma has already occurred. We want to provide supports to the community and to individuals to help kind of get their lives back on track. Sorry, my eyes are not as good as they used to be, so I needed to adjust the size of the slides. So we, since I took over, have created some goals for the department. We really want to increase collaboration, increase use of data, and then increase transparency and increase what I'm calling efficiency or organizational capacity and sustainability. So we want to increase our collaboration throughout the community safety ecosystem. As I mentioned, we're part of collaboration with 5 departments, but we really need to be collaborating with the entire city and outside of the city. We need to be working closer with the county, with Metro Transit, with houses of worship, with community organizations, with neighborhood groups. So part of my goal is to strengthen those lines of communication and how we work together. With data, we've been collecting a lot of data over time. What we need to do is improve the type of data that we're collecting and then use it to make decisions about how we move forward, to make sure that we're funding the most effective programs and then tweaking things when they aren't going quite as well as we want. And I always think about transparency is really related to data, but also you shouldn't have to wonder what we're doing. You should be able to look that up and find it out whenever you want. You should be able to go online, for example, and see what violence interrupters are doing, how many people they've helped, how impactful it is to the community. We're not there yet, but we're starting to create dashboards that get to that. And then around efficiency, we want to make sure that our department is efficient. Like I said, we want to fund the most effective and efficient programs, but we also need to do the same for the community organizations that we fund. Sometimes we've provided very small amounts of funding, which don't work for organizations that are already small, because how do you staff and how do you keep good staff if you're getting funding that maybe comes once a year, it might fall off the next year. We need to do better so that the organizations that we're partnering with, they can be a true partnership and they can have some longevity as well. So thinking just kind of broadly about all of the services that we have, I put them into buckets. The prevention, as I said, is the most important bucket. It's the thing that we should be doing the most. And so some of the services that fall in that bucket are Minneapolis, or people know them as the violence interrupters. We also have group violence intervention and youth group violence intervention, community safety ambassadors, and then we have a slew of violence prevention services. I'm going to go deeper into all of these programs, so don't worry. We don't really have anything under response right now. We used to manage the behavioral crisis response program, but City Council moved that under the fire department. So we don't have anything where you can call 911 and get one of our services dispatched. That's what's really considered a response service. And then under restoration, we have a number of contracts that do community trauma response. We also have the hospital-based violence intervention program, or Next Step. And then we have just recently taken on the work of the city related to ending human trafficking. And then I kind of threw in an other category because it didn't fit nicely into the 3 buckets I talked about. We have been doing capacity building for organizations. Generally, it's been capacity building for small organizations or individuals who want to work with the city to do violence prevention work, but maybe they don't know how to create a business, or they don't know how to actually contract with the city or the county. So we've been training them up to do those things. And then we've also been partnering with national organizations so that they can help train us as staff, but then that also trickles down to the organizations that we fund so that they can be following national best practices and we can be learning from those experts in the field. I think it's important to point out the difference between contracts and grants. You will hear me talk about contractors when I talk about community organizations, and then that's because we issue contracts, not grants. And those words get used interchangeably a lot in community, but they are actually really different things. And I think this is where sometimes we have some conflict between community organizations and the city, because their understanding is that we're giving them a grant, and you can see on the screen grants are really something that allow the organization to have autonomy in how they execute. They're given funding, often upfront, and then I think about it as, here's your money, go do good work. Provide us a report at the end. That's not what we do. We are contracting for services. So we are asking the community organization to sign a contract that says, you will do this service and we will reimburse you or pay you for that service. And that means we have really specific requirements about what that service looks like and how it's performed. And there's no money up front. Just like I don't get to go to work and they give me a paycheck before I start working, it's the same with contracts versus grants. And so Some people find that a little technical, but I just want to kind of plant that seed that there is a difference. So let's dig into some of the programs. Minneapolis, as I mentioned, is also known as the Violence Interrupters. What they do is recognize violence before it occurs, and then they try and interrupt the cycle of violence. So they're following the Cure Violence model, which is a national model, where these individuals have deep-seated relationships within the community. They use those relationships to get information. They might hear that somebody is coming out of prison and they might be ready to retaliate against somebody else. They might hear that two gangs in a neighborhood are going to fight. They can go to that area or even go to one of those people's houses and talk them down because of the relationships they have. They also then use their standing in the community and reputation to tell the community in general, this isn't how we live. Violence and crime is not normal in our community, and we won't stand for it. So they're messengers, they're credible messengers within their community. They'll show up sometimes at funerals. They'll often just be kind of street outreach, monitoring a specific neighborhood, but that relationship piece is critical. Oftentimes I get asked, well, can you take one of your violence interrupter teams and put them over here because something's happening over here? I can't, because they don't have a relationship in that side of town. It defeats the entire purpose of the model if I pick them up and put them someplace where they're not known, they don't have information or relationships to be able to calm people down or know where to go. So this is not something where we can move around chess pieces. We picked them because they have a relationship in a particular area, and we need to keep them there for the long term. That's the only way this program is successful. Right now we have 2 zones operating in North Minneapolis. We will soon have 3. And then we have 3 areas in South Minneapolis. And you can see the organizations that we have doing that on the screen. Again, we collect a lot of data. This presentation was created about a month ago, so numbers would be added to this if I had checked the stats right before. But they had done 271 mediations in 2025 year to date. They're passing out resources like mental health resources or housing, services and resources for substance use disorder. And then some of the groups actually pass out food. That's not something that the city funds them to do. They're often doing that on their own because they feel called to do so, just as part of their work. And it might be meals or it might just be cookies that get people to kind of interact with them and have a conversation. They all are wearing bright orange right now because we want them to be identifiable as a city service. So you can see on the screen they kind of have vests. We also have t-shirts, and in the winter they'll have similar bright orange jackets so that you know when you see these folks in community who they are. Now, group violence intervention, often we just refer to that as GBI or YGBI for youth group intervention. That follows a model of internal social pressures within groups or gangs. We used to call them gangs, now we call them groups because they're not quite as organized as they used to be. Again, that deter violence. And so this is a national model. We have a national technical assistance provider that helps us follow this national model. We, again, have people that have deep-seated relationships within the community, but this is more of a one-on-one service. So people get referred to us, often by police, sometimes from probation, and we're working on doing more community or even school referrals. But people have to have a gang or group affiliation or be at risk for having a gang or group affiliation. And so that might mean that they're a victim of a shooting, not somebody who necessarily has shot, because if you've been shot at, it might be that you are then going to retaliate, or you're going to find some people that will help you retaliate. This is a really kind of complicated service to describe to people because it's not what you would consider case management. So it's not that somebody is meeting with these individuals monthly and they're working on a specific plan to get out of group or gang life. That's not how group or gang involvement works. It's not that simple. These are folks where at 2 a.m. they need to call somebody because their gang is maybe telling them that they have to jump somebody. And we might need to fund a hotel in another state to get them out of the area alive. This is something where, yes, they maybe are working on getting a job locally, but it may be more just life or death situations that are happening, and we have to meet these individuals where they're at. So they will have their own very unique goals, but really success for this program is keeping individuals safe, alive, and free. That's it. And I think that's frustrating because sometimes people are like, but I want to know how many of them are getting jobs and how many of them are keeping their kids in their home and how many of them have stable housing, and those are all great, but a lot of these folks aren't there yet. Those are higher level skills, and we're just trying to keep them alive, out of jail, and safe from being wounded by guns. We can work on some of those other things later. So we have 5 organizations that are doing this work currently. And you can see it's really a 3-legged stool because we come at this with kind of a carrot and a stick mentality. Part of this program, especially for adults, is police and the community organizations that provide support will go together to an individual's home to say, hey, you're on our radar. And if you continue in this lifestyle, here's what's going to happen. We are going to catch you and we are going to prosecute you and you are going to prison. And it doesn't have to go there. Here are some folks who can help you. And they're people that they can relate to, people who have probably lived the same lifestyle that they have, and so they can feel free to talk to them. And so we come at it from both ways. And then periodically we'll do something called a call-in, where we'll have one gang or group come together and we'll have a really deep conversation about you are causing harm in our community. Here's the effect it's causing. We'll have voices from the community actually talk about those effects. And here's how we can get you more help. And often in other parts of the country, that has shown a decrease in group or gang violence from that particular group from doing a call-in. You have to really have data that supports that there's active violence from one particular group or gang to do that type of intervention, and we don't have that right now in the Twin Cities or in Minneapolis, which is why we haven't done a call-in recently. But that's, again, just one of many interventions that are part of this program. So a lot of things happening behind the scenes. I'm going to shift to community safety ambassadors. This is a new pilot that our department started just at the end of May. How many of you are familiar with the Downtown Improvement District safety ambassadors? Great. So you've seen the folks in green shirts walking around downtown. Sometimes they're emptying trash cans or they're pushing a cart. You can always count on them to tell you where the restaurant is that you're looking for. We took that approach and just focused it in on safety, and we're piloting it along East Lake Street and Franklin Avenue. So these folks are not going to be emptying trash cans or cleaning up necessarily, but they are a visible presence, so safety through space activation, and then they can make referrals. They have the shirts on, so again, you can tell that they're a city service. They will do frequent business checks, just seeing how businesses are doing, if they need any help. They will check in with anybody that they meet on the street, and they've done this. We have really interesting data showing that not just the numbers, which you can see on the screen, but more of the stories. So they checked on somebody who was sleeping at a bus stop and had to call for medical attention for that individual. They helped an elderly person cross the street because there were some cars that were not wanting to wait for that person to fully get across. And then soon we're going to have a dispatcher on our staff so that the community can actually call and ask for these safety ambassadors to come to them. So a business might say, there's somebody outside my store and they just won't get out of the doorway. I don't want to call the police, but I want them to go away. The safety ambassadors, they can't enforce the person going away, but maybe they can talk to the person and ask them what's going on, explain how they're prohibiting this business from doing their business and ask them to move someplace else, or connect them to resources like social workers that work in that area or food shelves in that area. They can also do safety escorts. So if somebody's leaving a business and like most of our life, it's dark after 4 p.m., you don't feel safe walking to your car, the safety ambassador could go to the business and walk that person to their car so that they feel safe. We have a lot of requests to expand this service throughout the city, but again, it just started in May. We need some data to prove that it's effective before we're going to expand it to other parts of the city. But you can see they've already had a lot of interactions with folks. So just in the first 3 months, they had more than 6,000 interactions with people. You can see they had 3,000-ish incidences. Well, an incident might be interacting with more than one person, which is why those numbers don't line up. And then you can see it breaks down Lake Street, Franklin Avenue. They're doing wellness checks, they're making referrals. Another nice thing is they can facilitate 911 or 311 reports. So I've seen them out taking pictures of graffiti, and they're reporting those to 311 so that the graffiti can get cleaned up. I talked about us having kind of a pool of violence prevention services. We've always done that, even when we were the Office of Violence Prevention. Generally, these are experienced and qualified community partners. They use their own unique strategies to prevent violence in their community. And so we might have some people who are working by having a presence on a street corner where there's a lot of activity so that they can offer supports to individuals who are hanging out on that street corner. We also might have folks who have a physical location where people can go and get supports like health and wellness materials or food or books. And then we have other folks who might be providing maybe yoga or mental health therapy for people who have experienced violence related to domestic violence or human trafficking. So it's a broad swath of the types of services because we believe that community organizations are the experts on what will be effective in their community. They serve many different areas of the city and they serve many different cultures of the city. So some are culturally specific, and that might mean East African, it might also mean LGBTQ. So it's really, they span the gamut. Right now, what we're trying to do is pre-approve, or we've done this, we pre-approved 34 organizations, and we're activating them as needed so that we can try and be a little more nimble within the community. Nothing is nimble within the city, just so you know. Even issuing a work order takes a long time to negotiate the scope of service and get all of the signatures needed, but we're trying some different strategies to see how we can best support the city of Minneapolis. Now, shifting over to that restoration side, it's still under our Violence Prevention Services program, but the hospital-based violence intervention is really restoration because what they do is encounter people in the hospital, in 4 hospitals, if they have been shot or stabbed. It's generally a violent crime that caused their wound. And so they will be called in at Children's, Park Nicollet, North Memorial, and HCMC. And they will be called by hospital staff to go to the bedside of these individuals and check in with them. The idea is to reduce retaliation, but also get them connected with services as quickly as possible. And sometimes folks aren't ready when they're in the hospital, but they're still making that connection. I think about it as planting seeds, and they'll follow up with them afterwards to see if they need support. This was really critical recently in the school shooting with Annunciation. They connected with all of those victims. And again, they might not have needed services at that time, but I know that they were following up with them afterwards when they were in a different headspace. And they're not I think school shootings are not the typical victims that these folks deal with, but they will go to anybody who has been shot or stabbed in those 4 hospitals. This is actually another way that we get referrals for the group or gang violence intervention program, because often when they're talking to somebody in the hospital, that person discloses that they have a group or gang affiliation, and then we can get them connected at that time with longer-term services. The other community trauma response services are like our violence prevention services. They really vary. They're throughout the city. You can see the map, and they vary by geography and by cultural specificity. I got the 5-minute warning, so I'm going to speed up a little bit. Human trafficking prevention and response is not a service that we have. This is different from everything else in that it's really more about a blueprint or a model to change policy and collaboration so that we can end human trafficking throughout the city. This has been part of the City of Minneapolis for a number of years. It's just recently come into our department, and so we're really excited. It seems like a good fit with all of the other violence prevention work that we're doing. So we're excited to amplify this work. What you can see on the screen is one of the visuals from the recent media campaign that was done in connection with the health department, telling people you don't have to stay silent. Your body is your own. It was really powerful, and we're going to reignite that campaign again this year. The Blueprint Approved Institute is that capacity building that I talked about with small organizations. And then I wanted to show you the map that we're creating so that people can see where these services are, because we get asked that a lot. Right now, this only reflects community safety ambassadors and the violence interrupters, but this is an interactive map where you could go on there, you could click on a zone, and you could see which organization is actually working in that area. Obviously, you can see the geographic boundaries of where they work, but there's also contact information for that organization. And so if you're a business in that area, a resident in that area, and you actually want to call them up and express some concerns about part of your neighborhood, you could do that. That's why we put the contact information in there. Over time, we're going to layer on additional services that we have, other violence interruption folks, some of the community trauma folks, so that anybody could see where there's a service that they might be able to utilize. And there was a request to talk about kind of what our funding looks like. It's not a lot. We have about $10 million. Those are expenses. The majority of that funding comes through general funds, so taxpayer dollars from the city. We get a small amount that's supplemented through grants, generally through the federal government, which is problematic right now. As you can imagine, we can't access those funds. And even those that we were able to access before the shutdown, there were people laid off, and so we couldn't find out, are we still getting the money next year? Because there was nobody to talk to in the CDC anymore. So that is not a great source of funding for us right now and potentially into the future. And so we're going to have to look at maybe leaning more on philanthropic partners or just doing what we can with the general funds that we're getting from the city. The significant drop-off that you can see from the 2024 to 2025 budget is when the behavioral crisis response unit was moved to the fire department. So all of that budget was moved to a different department. And there was some slight changes in how we were calculating in accounting to roll over funds, things like that. So it's not that they cut our budget because they didn't support our work. It was more about a program moved. Okay, that was fast. There's time for questions, but I will say, if you're interested in learning more about what we're doing, you can go to our web pages. We're updating those. Some of them are a little outdated, but that's one of my jobs with transparency, is making sure that they are updated. And then you can sign up for updates. There's a newsletter that we send out monthly so that folks can get information. We use it to communicate with the community organizations that we partner with, but also so that just anybody in the community can better understand what we're doing. And there's a very long web address on the screen, but you could just Google Neighborhood Safety Minneapolis and find this just as easily. And so now I will stop and we'll take time for questions.
If you have a question, please let me bring you the mic so that people who are not here in the room will be able to hear your question as well. Happy to have questions from the audience at this time.
I'm just curious how Minneapolis compares to other cities across the country as far as violence prevention, and does Minneapolis and your office stay in contact with cities that seem to be really successful in this effort, and perhaps communicate with them? And then the second question I have is, can Plymouth Church become directly involved with your efforts?
Great question. So how do we compare to other, I'll call them Office of Violence Prevention departments around the country? It's interesting that I think around the same time, many cities around the country created their Office of Violence Prevention, and it was generally about 5 years ago when we had the murder of George Floyd, the racial uprising, because it didn't just happen in Minneapolis, it happened around the world, quite honestly. But what I'm learning is we are pretty far ahead compared to some other cities because we're codified in the city's ordinance. I was just at a conference of National Office of Violence Prevention, and they were just trying to get kind of legitimacy for some of their departments, whereas Minneapolis is already ahead. Like, we exist in ordinance. They can't just stop funding our department because they wrote us into the laws. So that is great. It provides us a lot of protection. That being said, I am in contact with a lot of peer cities where things are successful: Durham, North Carolina, Albuquerque, New Mexico, and then I run into a lot of folks at conferences. It's one of the nice things about going to national conferences. It really depends on the context of your city. So in Albuquerque, for example, one of the things that made them so successful was they have a mayor that is all in on this system. And he funds, for every new police position, or for every 10 new police positions, they fund another position in their Office of Violence Prevention to do street outreach. That's a really significant way to show support. It's one thing to say with words at a press conference, I support this initiative. It's another thing completely to actually put your budget and funding behind it. I am not saying that Mayor Fry is not supportive of this, and we are in a different financial situation right now where all departments have to contract a little bit. But I think, there are differences in that. There are also differences in cities with how city council functions, and our city council does not agree right now, so it is hard to get some things done. The piece about how can Plymouth congregation help with us, I'm still trying to figure that out. Remember, I just started in May. So, there's the piece of funding, there's the piece of, I think, just helping us get people to understand that change takes time. This is not work where we have something on the ground and after 6 months, you're gonna see crime statistics drop. It just doesn't work that way. This is work that takes longevity and commitment and patience. And so just even being a voice to help your neighbors understand that, I think would be really significant. But I'll have to get back to you for a more thorough answer.
I was working and directing a youth center in North Minneapolis in the 80s, and on the north side, both on Olson Highway and Broadway, the whole area. And Curtis Sliwa's group was there. I can't remember their name. They came from New York, and they were only marginally successful because they didn't have those relationships. So the relationships are key. I would pick up these young people at their homes. There was the housing projects back then, and I was known as the person that said, he be knowing everybody in the hood. So that is the key, is to have relationships with as many of the children and mothers and fathers as you can.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Really going back to some of these programs don't work if you move them and you don't have those relationships built in. I will also say that's part of the challenge with national models. Just because it worked in Chicago or just because it worked in Portland doesn't mean it will work here. You can't just take a model, a framework, plunk it down here, because we live in a different context. The relationships are different, the culture is different here. And so even when we take best practices and national models, we have to tweak it to make it actually work here in our city.
Okay. I'll throw in, I won't throw in a question. Okay. I didn't see any hands.
Sometimes I wonder where Jesus would be if he came back. I have thought he might be at the southern border, but maybe he would be on Lake Street or Gaza, who knows, but it's Jesus, God's work, I think. This is really God's work, and that's my comment. Also, my question is, do you feel any threat from the National Guard or whoever it is that's going to these cities coming here?
That's a very timely question. The city in general is starting to plan for that, and then I reached out to my I'll call them my sister cities, but Brooklyn Park, Brooklyn Center, St. Paul, we're all talking together about just really late last week to start planning together what will we do when that happens. Because it's not so much an if, we really think it's a when. And I don't have a firm answer about what our response will be, but we're planning.
The north side says it's been making a lot of good progress in the community, less so on the south side. Could you please talk about some of the issues that have made the south side more problematic, and what, if anything, we might be do something about that?
So we really publicly talked about, we've been winning on the north side. Crime is down, and it is. The data supports that, and the people that live there verbalize that as well. And I've been trying to figure out what is the difference, what worked there. I was talking to a community member on the south side the other day, and he said the south side's the new north side. He said the south side is the new north side, which is sad, but also it's true. I think some of it, a lot of it is opioids, quite honestly. Opioids and folks who are unhoused. You never saw encampments like that on the north side. And I don't know why that is, but there have been so many encampments on the south side. And then what comes along with that, unfortunately, are people who are preying on people who are unhoused, and so they're going in and they're selling drugs. They're going in and they're trafficking women. Literally maybe in your backyard or on the lot next to your house. And it's hard because we have people who disagree on how do we help people who are unhoused, but I think we all agree that trafficking humans, drug sales are not something that are acceptable in our community. And so it's hard then to combat the issue if we don't agree kind of what to do with the individuals who are unhoused and what to do with the encampments. The other piece is we're never actually solving the problem. We can throw a lot of resources at it, but we're really just squeezing people into other areas of the city. And so I think about Lake Street, and we'll do some stuff to clean up Lake Street. And then I was at a community meeting more down by Keewaydin, and now the neighbors down there are seeing more people panhandling on their corners. And it's just the same people, they're just getting moved around the city. And so I certainly don't have a solution, but I think the human trafficking, the drugs, the being unhoused are kind of the three main things that I'm seeing leading a lot of the issues in South Minneapolis.
Hi, I apologize if this was covered because I arrived a little late, but by numbers, did you cover how many violence interrupters there are currently?
I didn't specifically say how many of them there were. What we have is 5 zones currently, and each zone has 5 violence interrupters, 2 outreach workers, and a supervisor. I cannot do that math standing right here, but I hope that helps you to figure out. And then we'll have a 6th zone up hopefully this week.
There's been some coverage in the media about problems with some of the violence interrupter groups, that there's been violence on behalf of the violence interrupters against some citizens. Could you talk a little bit about how violence interrupters are trained, and especially those coming out of prison? How do we move them beyond a paradigm of violence to community support?
Yeah, that's really, thanks for bringing that up, actually. So there was obviously some news about people involved in shootings, or maybe people who were involved in other physical alterations. First, I just want to say those weren't violence interrupters. So the violence interrupters, like I mentioned, follow this national model, this cure violence model. And the groups that were involved with that were not. They were not contracted or trained to follow that national model. Part of that national model is also providing supports, to get to your second point, for the people with lived experience doing this work. Because if they're not in a good place, they shouldn't be out on the street doing the work. And so for the people that we contract that do this, they always start off their shift by doing a check-in. Just how are you doing as a human? And if your check-in number is too low, the supervisors will pull you aside and figure out if you're in a place where you can actually do the shift, or if you maybe need to go home. We've also required all of these organizations to have mental health insurance for all of the people. They used to just be contractors, which meant the organization could do whatever they want. But because we feel it's so important for them to have their physical and mental health taken care of, we required them to have health insurance. And so there are many other groups doing similar work to violence interrupters. They might be called violence interveners by the county. They might just be called street outreach. It might be something where there's a contract through the state or through the county. We also have some other street outreach groups who are not following the violence interruption model. So the training is different depending on which model you actually follow. I can't speak for how the county is training their folks or how the state is training their folks. But we do have some other street outreach groups that do not follow that model who are also not involved in the violence, just to be clear. And their training is not as rigorous because they're not following a national model. So I think but we also don't have the requirements that they maybe have that lived experience in criminal justice for those groups. We want them to have relationships in the neighborhood, and so hopefully they live in or near the area where they're patrolling, but they don't necessarily have to have that background or reputation that would allow them to work with people involved more in criminal activity.
Great, thanks. I think we have time for one more question, if anybody has one. If not, I do. Okay, I didn't notice any reference in there to gun control. Does your office, any of your offices get involved in trying to help the city move toward better gun control?
So the gun control question is related to our work, but we have not been doing advocacy necessarily about gun control specifically. It's one of the recommendations from the Safe and Thriving Communities report is to increase gun control. And so we're thinking about how do we, as an Office of Community Safety, lobby? What is our role with gun control? What I've done more on an individual level is passing out gun locks, telling people where to find them, making sure that they have access. The groups that we have on the street have access to that. And then we're trying to figure out, for example, if we have somebody who's group or gang involved and they have a gun that they're willing to pass on, how do we safely dispose of that gun? So we're definitely doing this on more of a micro level, and we have to figure out what is our stance, what is our lobbying stance, kind of on a macro level.
Okay, great. All right, thank you so much. Could we have a round of applause for our presenter? I don't know about the rest of you, but I had no idea about 1/10 of this stuff. And so, Amanda, thank you so much. Excellent, valuable presentation. I'd like to remind you, we have another presentation coming up next Sunday. Our presenter will be Cody Bordeaux of our own staff, and he'll be talking about music and composition. So please feel free to join, which I think will be interesting to many of us. And many of us did not know that Cody had this area of background or expertise. So please join us next week. Thanks again.